Malhotra, the budget is going to be announced tomorrow, and all eyes are going to be on what changes will be introduced and what changes will be kept. Well, the world is going through a recessionary trend. Major economies are worried that the current layoffs that we have seen, specifically by big tech, is a symptom, a sign of an ailing economic future. But at the same time, many agencies have also gone on to hail and promote the concept of India and how it is the lone bright spot in an environment which is not only gloomy but at the same time very despondent. We'll talk about what can be expected tomorrow and how it will in fact keep India on the trajectory that it has enjoyed despite a number of impediments, despite a number of challenges that the world somehow has not been able to contend with. With us on the show at this point in time is Mr. Sumit Peer, political commentator. Mr. Sandeep Chachra, human rights defender, is also with us on the program. Mr. Rajiv Gupta, senior economist, here with us as well. Last but not the least, Mr. Ajay Dua, former Commerce Secretary of Government of India. He's an economist too, joining us on the program. Sumit Peer, I'd like to begin with you. Well, what is that one particular thing that the government is going to be worried about? We have spoken about fiscal deficit in the past too many times. But the fact of the matter is, Sumit, that capital expenditure has to be a primary priority for the government to make sure that, the contention about job growth and MSME growth is once and all settled with. MSMEs, as we know, Sumit, they amount for a large portion, a large chunk of our GDP. They amount for a large portion of, the working force as well. About 120 million people or even more are employed by some of these MSMEs. Is that a part of the purview that the government is going to try and handle? And also at the backdrop, Sumit, let's not forget that rationalizing tax regimes and basically also, propounding the new regime to the new audience is also going to be a headache that Nirmala Sitharaman will have to contend with, because the old regime is still popular, Sumit. I know I've asked you too many points, but I want you to address those.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. In fact, the main thing is going to be we have to keep on doing the capital expenditure, which you rightly said, because that's the only way to create jobs. Now, the job here is not an appointment letter with a PFI and a ESI number, but it is an opportunity to earn. Rozgar ke avsar. If we don't keep on creating jobs, if you talk of SMEs, out of the US GDP around 24-25 trillion, 60% is contributed by SMEs. So SME is the powerhouse of any economy, and looking down upon the SMEs is the last disaster you can do. SMEs create maximum employment, and SMEs are going to be the driving factor, driving motor of the Indian economy. Manufacturing is going to be the driving motor. But with it, if we want to have the FDIs and all coming, we must have the infrastructure. If you today, for example, if you look at the US infrastructure, the US has to put trillions of dollars to revamp the infrastructure, around $34 trillion as per my estimates, and every year they need to put $1.7 trillion because the infrastructure is quite outdated. Now the infrastructure which we are building and the demographic dividend we have for next 30-40 years, we are poised for growth. We are poised to take over as the world's #1 economy. That is what we will be heading down. We need by another 23 years down the line, as per EN, we will be $25.8 trillion economy. But the thing what we have to fight on is we are also a welfare state. We are giving food to 80 crore people and all that we should give, and that is the right thing to do. But what is baffling and what is worrying me is that people have still this concept and notion of sarkari nokri and a nokri in their mind, which is slowing down the economy somehow. What we are focusing on startups, that is the best thing to do. But my idea has been always focus on unitary entrepreneurship. Unitary entrepreneurship is much more powerful than the startup, and for a unitary entrepreneurship, anybody can be an entrepreneur. For example, if I tell you today 27% of the women work in India, if you are able to get women folk into the mainstream and they make around $100 a month, which can be even by having a cow at your place, and it can be easily made. Somebody might call it pakodanomics, but when I tell you the number, people will be amazed. Within 2 years, as per McKinsey, we will double our GDP. That is the power what we have as 1.4 billion people. Now, freebies is a danger which our economy is looking at too. Giving everything for free is the most imminent danger what our economy is looking at too. This revdi politics is the most imminent danger what our economy is looking at too. Because we can all build a nation and there can be a big leak where everything will lose. You can keep on pouring the bucket with the tap, but if the leak is bigger than the tap, you will lose everything. Look what happened to Venezuela. That is the kind of thought which scares my mind. And the last point I want to make here is, we need the most eminent taxpayer here is the middle class, is the salaried class. They need some respite, because after COVID, after layoffs, afford the kind of things were happening. And incidentally, none of the Indian companies are laying off. It's all the big names. And I told somebody once on a show that Google will lay off people. He DM'd me Google's balance sheet, was trying to make a point to me, look at the balance sheet of Google, but Google has also done the layoffs. So that, you know, the notion of this MNC culture, MNC is good, whatever has a Farang name is good, that is also getting dwindled. Now, none of the Indian companies are doing the layoffs. No, TCS is hiring more and more people. Look at the TCS's results which are just out. Fantastically good. And for a person like, for a company like Google, you need to lay off people. So this thing of Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat has to be there. We have to trust Indian. Vocal for local is the way ahead. And we need, the most important thing is, this salaried class needs respite from tax, needs the standard deductions, ATC. If you look at the taxable income, they have to be increased. In my opinion, anybody needs a 50,000 rupees today to bring up a one child in a house and to take care of his parents. So after 50,000 rupees, that is 6 lakh rupees per annum. That should be completely tax-free. There should be no tax on that, and even think of reducing the income tax on the middle class, because they have to anyway pay. You have, most of the salaried people get a TDS. Its tax is directed at the source, while others can still, you know, it's a very kind of, I don't know how to put it. It's a very different world. If you're running a business and if you have a Mercedes, right, which you use, you say, oh, Mercedes I need a Mercedes to come and go to the office. So, you know, the depreciation of Mercedes will not come in my income. The interest I pay will not come in my income, and the EMI I pay will not come in my income. But if you're a salaried person, you have an Alto, oh, that you are rich, that is your income. So why this kind of disparities in our country? Why a business can be allowed millions of dollars or rupees or millions of rupees of expense, while a normal man, a middle class man earning, let's say 50, 70,000 rupees, he's not allowed 20, $30,000 of a liberty. A car, a Mercedes is allowed there, here a Alto is taxed. These kind of things need to be taken care of. We have reached a time when we can afford to do it. Let's do it. Let's show a bigger heart.
Mr. Chachra, what do you think should be the expectations from this budget? Let us also not forget, Mr. Chachra, that this is perhaps on the lines of being a populist budget as well. 2024 is when the Loksabha elections are going to take place, and that budget which is going to be presented in 2024 and is obviously not going to be a full budget. This has to appeal to the Aam Aadmi, this has to appeal to the common sense of the country as well. This also has to cater to the investor sentiment, and this also has to, you know, address a part of, or rather an angle towards the voter that will win hearts. Do you concur?
Of course I do, and thank you for having me here. And I was listening to the earlier speaker, Shri Sumit Peer, with great respect and interesting points there. You see, I do expect a populist budget, and there's nothing wrong with populism, because you see, about 80% or so of our working people are not in the tax bracket. They're below the tax bracket, so to say. So one would want to see a budget. We may have come out in that spirit. So we may have come out of the pandemic, but precariousness continues among the working people, which are the majorities, incidentally, of India, particularly the informal sector workers, which are 94% of our workforce. You know, data of, I will not get too much into data because you're looking for what needs to be done, but data is indicative of that. If you look at the periodic labor force survey, the kind of rate of unemployment that it reports, 7.3% in the quarter ending September 22, or even the CMI data this January, 8.3% CMI data talks of. So there is persistent and deep unemployment. And I think if you look at other data of household consumption, I mean, data is not readily available of household consumption. But one of the earlier data by NSSO, which was pre-COVID and which was withdrawn later on due to, you know, suggested false methodology, did talk of household consumption contraction, and that's worrying. So in a sense, precarities continue massively. On top of that, and I concur with Sumit Pierji that we cannot undo food subsidies, but the recent withdrawal of the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Ann Yojana worries, though, and it won't be, in my opinion, won't be offset by the PDS 2 rupees waiver that has been given. But having said it, I think the focus of this budget need to be a strong welfare response in light of the majorities of our country. So we do need significant investment, into, and I'll go through 3 or 4 points in this. Firstly, into the question of public employment. You see, we do need to create more employment in the public realm. MSMEs is another point I'll come to, but we do need a strong revival of MGNREGA. Last year's budget of MGNREGA, which was to 73,000 crores, it was below the revised estimates of 21-22, which was 1.3 lakh crores. So I think one would expect this budget to at least go to the revised estimate levels of 21-22, which is over 1 lakh crore rupees. There have been pending wages in the MGNREGA. Some activist groups talk of about 20,000 crores, which is still pending wages. So the budget must factor in MGNREGA. Periodic labor force data again suggests that workers are available for work in rural India and in urban India. And today's data from Economic Survey talks of falling urban employment. So I think these are concerns, and they need to be responded strongly through a public employment creation program in rural India and the new phase in urban India. The urban employment guarantee program should be initiated. An expansion of employment from 100 days to 200 days have long been calls, and I think these need to be looked at. If you look at data on social protection, India is well below the global average, and I think we should aspire in that direction, well below the global average of what is the percentage spent of GDP spent on social protection. We are spending 1.4% of our GDP on social protection, social security measures, whereas the global average is somewhere near, or developed country average is somewhere near around 30%. So I think we must close this gap. I think 24% of Indians, 24.4% of Indians are covered under one form of social security or another, excluding health. I think we must expand that. Even in health, where 55% of the Indians are covered, it is insurance based. So we do need much higher volumes of investments, and also higher volumes of the extent of social security that we have. I think that's the second point I'd like to make. I think with reference to the point made by Sumitji on women of India, gender budgeting was used as a fiscal tool, started in 2005, was promoted as a fiscal tool to correct gender inequities in budgeting. And I think gender budgeting has stayed somewhat static. Some would say it has reduced a bit. I think we need strong correction to that. In that regard, the entire focus on ensuring that more and more women come into the working sphere is an important step. Now, this can only happen if the domestic unpaid care burden of unpaid care work is reduced. This can only happen when public services are made gender responsive and higher investments are given into public services. This can only happen if you have national campaigns focusing on valuation of women's work, but also redistribution and sharing of women's unpaid work at home. I think this can also happen by giving specific initiatives, such as actually creating an unemployment allowance for women in the working age, the young women workers unemployment allowance. These are necessary indicators that I expect in the budget. The question of climate looms large. Several reports have pointed to the fact that India is at the receiving end of it. One report even went to say that the amount of losses suffered is only second in the world, the impact of climate and the climate-induced losses in India. More importantly, the World Bank estimation says that by 2050, out of the 80 million jobs lost worldwide due to heat stress, 34 million will be in India. And I think we need to offset these losses. It was wonderful to see the leadership of India at the climate summit more recently in Egypt.
Right.
Where India, very quickly.
You attended that as well. You attended that forum as well,
yes,
Mr. Chawla.
Yes, and one saw the leadership of India with G77 and China to push for a loss and damage fund. I think that was agreed globally. It's yet to unravel. But the fact remains that I think nationally it is very important, and we have the ability to do so, to institutionalize, to finance a loss and damage financing facility for millions of farmers or millions of workers who are suffering on account of climate change. Heat wave impact we saw last year, and how the workers lost out on their incomes and raised expenditures. So I think we need to offset these issues. We also need to sort of look at, and I want to come back quickly and end here, on the question of education. We have seen a decreasing amount of budgetary outlay in the percentage sense go to education sector. And we're just coming out of the pandemic, and I would urge that the question of ensuring that education sees much higher budget outlay. I mean, the expectations are up to 6%, but even if we get a 3.5%, that will be one step forward. Healthcare, for instance, the healthcare expenditure cries. The condition of rural health infrastructure, the doctors, the facilities, the infrastructure of the PHCs. We saw some hope and we saw some revival and some more input into the health sector during the COVID years, but sadly it hasn't sustained. So one would like to see that long question being addressed soon. Thank you, and this is it for now, but I'll come back when
Right,
have
of course, more to hear from Mr. Chatra as well. Mr. Ajay Dua, if you can hear me, sir. Mr. Dua, if you can hear me, sir.
Please.
Sir, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I can hear you now, sir. So what do you think is going to be the priority tomorrow? Fiscal prudence? Is it going to be putting more money into the hands of consumers? Is it also going to be about, following on the footsteps that we have adhered to so far when it comes to our GDP and other figures which have, definitely made India a considerable and a very attractive place to invest in? What do you think can be expected from this budget tomorrow? And last but not the least, sir, this is also something which has to be popular because the government is looking for a comeback in 2024. They're going to make sure that all the grudges, any grouse that the Aam Aadmi that the Aam Aadmi has is taken into consideration.
I think you're qualifying your question with the comment at the end answers it all. This is a pre-election budget, last full year budget pre-election, and with 9 elections in state governments, which is a maximum in any year, which we have seen in recent years. So I don't think any government in power, be it the NDA government or the UPA or any other kind of a government, they can ignore this fact that they have to go before the electorate and in a large way in the current year and soon thereafter in March, April, in February to April next year. Having said that, I think they are also, the government in power is also conscious of the fact that they are in a fairly strong position politically. So they can afford to marry the populist tendencies with fiscal consolidation as well as consideration of growth. So I expect, despite this huge electoral pressure on them, that they would not go entirely in a populist manner and would keep in mind that fiscal consolidation takes as much precedence, fiscal consolidation and GDP growth and macroeconomic factors take as much importance as their earlier concern. So what does it translate into? I think if we were to talk about schemes, certainly the orientation of the budget would be to take care of the people at the bottom rung, people in the rural areas, farmers in particular, as well as the lower middle class and the middle class in the country. There may not be very much for the upper middle class or the rich in this budget. Similarly, there may not be very much for industry, organized industry, compared to the other sections of the industry, other than augmentation of the PLI scheme, which has started delivering results with the benefits being focused onto a set of beneficiaries and who are required to fulfill certain obligations. So I do see the Pradhan Mantri Jan Kalyan Yojana, which has been extended till from January to December this year, continuing and being sufficiently provided for, which means actually provision of a huge provision of about 2.5 trillion rupees, 2.5 lakh crore rupees. I also see that the provision for subsidy for fertilizers, which is across the board to our farmers, whether big or small or whatever they might be growing, that would not be reduced. And during the current year, because of the Ukraine war and most of our fertilizer being imported, particularly the MOP and the DAP, and about a third of the urea, the government will continue to provide well for it, roughly about 2 lakh crores, 2 trillion rupees. And I also see the Manrega scheme, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, being provided adequately right in the beginning of the year and not later in the year by saying it's a demand-driven scheme, and whenever if government finds savings, it diverts them to it. I'm hoping that almost a lakh of crores would get provided there compared to about 60 to 70,000 crores,
Right.
which has been done.
Right. Okay. Mr. Gupta, if you can hear me, I'd like to take your opinion on this important day as well. The economic survey came out today. Mr. Gupta, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, I can.
Mr. Gupta, the important point that India has to keep in mind is that we are not supposed to rest on our laurels. You know, we have gone past a number of problems and impediments, but that doesn't mean they can't come back again. Although China seems to be a compromised destination for investment at this point in time, popular sentiment still wants to go with China. Do you think this will also be an exercise in making sure that the fifth largest economy tag that India has been able to achieve very recently sticks on, and at the same time the momentum that we have seen in terms of our domestic growth also is well adhered to?
So thanks for having me. I think one of the things that I would like to say at the outset is that when we are talking about budget, we are talking about so many things. It seems like you need a magician to be able to put everything together. To my mind, this budget will need to see, reducing of fiscal deficit, which is a must. To my mind, I do not think that it will be a very populist budget. I mean, when I say populism, first of all, populism also has to be defined. I think we tax soft, etc., is what we talk about when we talk about populism. That kind of populism, I do not think will be available because there is very little room to maneuver. We are at 22, 23 lakh crore of revenue receipts and already at about 40 lakh crores of expenditure, and the borrowings are pretty much high. So I don't think that there will be a very heavy this thing on taxation side. There could be certain things in terms of just taking care of inflationary trends, but nothing which is immensely there. To my mind, the populism in this case or the fiscal prudence where they both combine is trying to look at the rural economy and strengthening the rural economy in some manner. To my mind, there would be a lot of impetus on rural growth, which is by creation of cooperatives, etc., which also kind of ties into what Sumit was saying, where women and people from the rural areas could actually be contributing to the economy in a much larger fashion. And there are large number of people who reside in our villages. So I think that rural economy will have to be given an impetus. To my mind, the infrastructure growth will keep on happening. I think there will be more impetus on that side, which will lead to employment generation. So I think those are the things that the country would be looking at. Coming back to China, I think the overall sentiment in the world is China plus one, which is already kind of settled into a very large extent. India is one of the sort of gainers from that in terms of trying and getting the manufacturing shifted to India. However, India is not the only country. There are other countries vying for it also. So, basically the whole impetus on ease of doing business, the whole impetus on kind of simplifying the regulations, etc., has been strongly adhered to, and it is taking place all over. States are working overnight as well to kind of look at how do they simplify and how do they make things better. And I sit on the European Business Group. I see a lot of European companies and European countries who have a very, very positive outlook towards India in terms of shifting their manufacturing bases. So I think all of this is happening correctly. The only thing that we need to be sort of cognizant of is that the borrowing, the debt GDP ratio is kind of rising because of pandemic, etc. But it has risen to an extent. There is a fiscal deficit which is quite heavy. We have an interest burden which is increasing. So we need to be rather being populist. We need to put our money in capex and in infrastructure development and strengthening the rural economy.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. But Sumit, the expectations from the Aam Aadmi are plenty. They're expecting that there is going to be some respite in the tax brackets. And the government also will focus on keeping this economic growth exactly where it is. But at the end of the day, the government also has to balance its books. There is a responsibility. So which way is this pendulum going to swing faster and deeper?
Vineet, it is like jaan hai, desh hai, hum hai. So we don't have to become a Venezuela by any chance. That is the only fright which scares me, because we have a lot of political parties here which are out on a mission to do it. So the idea is we have to make these things more and more tighter. Even the Honorable Supreme Court has intervened in this, because it will not take you, it will take you 75 years to become Bharat, but it will take you just 5 years to become Venezuela. That is the biggest threat we are facing. We can manage our things, we can manage our taxes, we can give a little bit of respite to the salaried class and middle class. We are giving food to the 80 crore people. That's all good and that should be done, and that is what has saved us. But the biggest threat what I see is we can still manage, and we have the highest FDI coming to India. So I don't see a dearth of investment, I don't see a dearth of opportunities. But what do we do this in this mechanism? And this money is not given money of the exchequer is not given as subsidies. Money for capital expenditure is not used for subsidies. And then some people will argue and tell you, look, my budget is balanced because you took all the money for capex. We were supposed to build the capital expenditure. You gave them a Bijli Pani subsidy. So there's kind of budgets also happen here. So they will say, my budget is positive, but you will not say, what have you done for infrastructure? So infrastructure push is the number one thing we need, because we have 900 million youth. If we want them to be employed, if we want them to be productively employed, if we want from 27% our women, in China it is 65% women who are working. We want our women involvement in the economy to increase. We have to create opportunities to earn. Opportunities to earn can be only created when you do a lot of capital expenditure, when you put a lot of money on infrastructure, because with the decoupling or friendly offshoring, what they call now, friendly offshoring happening, India is going to be the destination of the choice. We are ready next 20 years. 23 years, we're talking of $25.8 trillion of GDP for a $3.17 trillion. So we are talking of precisely we need 20
But Sumit, Mr. Chachra also alluded to a very important point, which is, the job scenario, especially in our MSME sector as well as, rural areas. How is that going to be tackled by the finance minister? Because, it also is a requirement. At the same time, it also plays to the gallery when it comes to a popular budget.
Vineet, look, today, if you look, for example, we have been talking a lot about the green energy and all. The country is today total 42% of the energy used by the country of 1.4 billion is green energy today. It is again a world record, 42%. And we are done in the shortest amount of time. So when you do projects, when you do infrastructure projects, it's the opportunity to earn. It's a rozgar ke avsar. That is why I have been saying and focusing on one thing. Startups are good, they're brilliant, I love them, but focus more on unitary entrepreneurship. We should have more and more schemes like Mudra scheme and all which talk of unitary entrepreneurship, wherein anybody can become an entrepreneur and make his $50, $100, $200, $500 depending on the kind and the quantum of business you do. Let's not celebrate startups only, let's also start celebrating unitary entrepreneurship. If we have 50, 100 schemes of unitary entrepreneurship, now these schemes, like if you look at the Mudra scheme, I think 60% of the people who took loans are women and 94 to 96% of people have returned their loans. So if these kind of things are happened and we have more of Mudra schemes and more of these entrepreneur kind of schemes, we have more of cooperatives. Today, incidentally, Vineet, Amul is the #1 FMCG company of India. It has beaten Nestle and Unilever and all. I think this year it will be 65,000 crores. So and Amul is publicly, is not private. It is held by the government of India. It's not even a limited company. If an cooperative like Amul can do it, which will be the number one FMCG company of India, if we literally use local for vocal and every unit will have an export of its own. That's what the Honorable Prime Minister has given us the vision. Every district will have an export of its own. So let's bring those schemes to that district level and so that there is no migration happening to cities. The moment you stop the migration happening to cities and you have those, and we really celebrate those heroes, what I call as the local entrepreneurs, so the unitary entrepreneurship, that the urge or this number of jobs will go down. We know the job is the opportunity to earn Rozgar ke avsar, not a letter from a government of India with a PFI and ESI number. That mentality has to go down, and people have been trying to challenge this thing, saying pakodonomics and all. But really, pakodonomics, economics, you might not like it.
Okay, Mr. Chachra, notwithstanding the points that you made earlier about, the job scenario in our country, do you think that India has perhaps bypassed, the effects and the ill effects rather of the pandemic better than any other country around us? And the problems that, we've spoken about, the ones you have also enunciated, they will perhaps take time. It will take more than one budget to take care of that.
No, for sure. And I think that's very important that, yes, I agree with you that we are better placed. We fared in the pandemic better. But let me also say that precarities continue. And let me also not take attention away from the prevailing precarities. I agree with the previous speaker, Sumit ji, and earlier as well, that cooperatives and cooperative economy in rural and in urban India is a good way forward. It creates collective enterprise. I will rather add something to self-enterprise. Collective enterprises, it creates autonomy, it creates dignity of working people. So there are many, many pluses there. So I think that's also a big investment point. I would also like to comment on this whole question of fiscal prudence, which the speaker previous was highlighting. I think it's important. We know that 45 to 50% of our revenue receipts are going into debt servicing of one kind or another. And I think that's an area of concern. We know economic survey has told us inflation will keep higher. RBI has told us the inflation will be up to about 6.8%. We know growth won't be as rosy as it was 3 years ago, 2 years ago. It'll be the lowest in perhaps the 3 years, given the global headwinds, given the global recessionary tendencies. So the question comes centrally to the question of revenues and how do we expand the size of the cake? And I think this is something very crucial to discuss as we are discussing budgets and the way forward. We need investments for future. We need an India for future, while also sort of looking at the current challenges that we have. In that regard, I think we need to look at data on the kind of revenues we forego, what is called revenues foregone. And I think that's important to see. Some estimates will vary, but the estimates I'd go with is about 1.4, 1.5% of GDP is what is technically could be called revenues foregone. Now, these are three types. First is the income tax revenues foregone. Estimates are that 30 to 40%, if we are more tax efficient, if we have better tax efficiency system, 30 to 40% we can sort of add on within that 1.4 crores. The other major chunk is the corporate tax benefits being given. This was introduced in 2019. And I think perhaps it's time to look at that. Perhaps it's time to go back on that and look at the kind of tax breaks we are giving to large corporates, because in this time, the World Inequality Labs will tell you, our own data will tell you that accumulation of wealth at one level has intensified and precarities of, sort of misery have accumulated on the other end. So I think it's important at this stage to introduce measures which do not let corporates or large wealth accumulators do as they wish. So progressive taxation has been always India's way. And I think in this regard, newer innovative measures of doing away with those tax benefits to corporates or reducing them, and also introducing wealth tax is an important way to expand revenues, because tax efficiency will only take you that far, because as I already said, 20-25% of India is within the tax bracket, so it will only take you that far. And the other important thing to look at is the kind of excise revenues foregone due to free trade agreements. So I think the point for India would really be how to expand the revenue or the inputs, rather than how to keep managing your books with a limited revenue that you have. And there the question comes, how do you, so fiscal prudence, not in the limited sense, but fiscal prudence can only be tackled by an expansion of the revenue cake. Because we do need welfareism, we do need a strong welfare response given the state of popular classes that we are in. And lastly, I would just add one more point before I hand it over. This is the whole question of agriculture. Rural India was pointed to. So I would hope that the subsidies on agriculture continue, given the sense of, the agrarian distress that we've seen over the years. The subsidies on fertilizers continue, other forms of subsidies on agriculture continues. This is a global norm. Everybody subsidizes agriculture. Developed countries, developing countries, and we have to do that. I don't think that's something to cut. I also think on agriculture side, important steps have been taken in this regard, particularly on the PDS. This is the year of millets, and the government of India is celebrating it. A few years ago, the government of India brought in millets into the public procurement system, but only 1% of the public procurement is coming from millets. And I think that needs to expand.
Okay, all right. You've raised some good points, Mr. Chachra. Mr. Dua, if you can hear me, I'd like to come to you. Mr. Dua?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah,
please.
well, taking a leaf out of what Mr. Sandeep Chachra said, rural population, it's 65% of the total population of India, and it is also a key to electoral success. It is also critically important for the government to accelerate the economic growth for these 65% of the people. Do you think there is going to be a renewed thrust on rural infrastructure development and credit availability, which has been a problem?
The budget can do only a limited amount of things, because after our committed expenditures on various things, particularly debt servicing, as well as pensions, salaries, etc., we have the finance minister has only about 15% of the budget size available for discretionary spending, which amounts to, in a 40 lakh crore budget, just comes to about 6 to 7 lakh crore rupees. So on that itself, I think to expect her and the government to give.
So there seems to be a problem with your network.
Policy is going to be possible tomorrow. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. I can hear you now, sir.
Really?
I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Yes. So what I'm saying is, I don't see the headroom available to the finance minister that there will be any greater outlays for rural development schemes, but results have been fairly satisfactory, which means the employment guarantee scheme, as well as the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, the residential scheme, the residential building scheme, that will probably get greater provisions. And also the scheme which would continue would be the agricultural schemes, which is the mainstay of the rural area, mainly the PDS support, which passes on to the farmers through the minimum support price offered by the FCI on behalf of Government of India, as well as the scheme of Pradhan Mantri Kisan Yojana. That might get enhanced from 6,000 rupees a person, a farmer, to 8,000 rupees. There is an expectation that to neutralize the inflation which has been experienced since this scheme was introduced 3 years ago, that it warrants being enhanced.
Okay, so there seems to be a problem with your network. It keeps coming and going. Let me just quickly rope in Mr. Rajiv Gupta as well. Mr. Gupta, if you're there with us. Mr. Gupta?
Sure.
Yeah.
Mr. Gupta, what about the manufacturing sector? If we are going to accelerate our economic growth, and if we are going to be, in fact, be emotional about being looked upon as an alternative to China, and command the global supply chain, what, according to you, is the pivotal priority that the finance minister is to focus on?
No, I think manufacturing definitely will be given impetus. There is no doubt in my mind on that side, because as I said, with the China plus one mentality which is there. I mean, India needs to kind of take on the opportunities for being the manufacturing hub. So that will definitely get impetus. And apart from that, I mean, when I was talking about the rural this thing, I was primarily talking about impetus on cooperatives. I see that happening definitely. I mean, there is a Ministry of Cooperatives which is in any way which has been formed, and for the last 1 year, every state has kind of been kind of talking about these cooperatives. So that is the kind of way of strengthening the rural economy. Manufacturing, definitely 101% it will get impetus through various schemes.
Sumit Peer, coming back to you if you're there. Sumit, if you're there with us. Okay. Mr. Chachra, coming back to you. Mr. Chachra,
Yes,
well,
Yes,
the role of manufacturing, how important is that going to be in terms of the area that you also are concerned about, which is of course job growth as well as inclusivity of the rural population?
No, I mean, there can be no doubt that manufacturing is key, an important key to the future. And I think the question with manufacturing, and I think we need much more of that. We've seen actually decline in people employed by the manufacturing sector. This is in the years prior to COVID. I don't have the more recent data, but that's important to sort of keep in mind that how labor intensive, given that there's a large labor surplus or a reserve surplus. I mentioned about the fact that roughly 12 to 18 hours per week, and this is not my data, this is periodic labor force survey. If you ask workers how much more, how much is their vacant time, it's 12 to 18 hours per week. And even when you measure the employment rate, it is based on availability or if any worker has worked 1 hour per week. So there's a lot of underemployment and unemployment. In that regard, the key to manufacturing will be labor intensive manufacturing. That is something that we need to be wary of, because we do have the specter of industry 4.0. We do have which is also needed, but we do have that challenge where you go into artificial intelligence, robotics, less labor, or sort of called labor sans industrialization, and that danger is there. And our advantage would be to have people in the jobs, and therefore impetus on manufacturing sector, mostly on the medium, small and micro enterprises and other manufacturing sector, is a key way forward for us. And that investments I'd be watching in the budget as well. That is a key area to get into sovereignty, into security, into creating further impetus, further what is called roll-on effects for future. So that's how I see manufacturing sector, and that would be a key expectation. Apart from agriculture that I spoke of earlier, apart from public employment programs that I spoke of earlier. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Dua, the China Plus One strategy, which has benefited India so far in terms of investments and alternative scenario as well, is it likely to find a fillip and a boost when the budget is announced tomorrow?
Is that question for me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think you muted me. Could you just, thank you so much. I'm not sure whether by itself the government would be able to do very much more than what the headroom available to it is financially on this aspect. But it is certainly fairly high up in the minds of the authorities that be, that if India has to get into the supply chain, the alternative supply chains which are being developed, and most of the alternate supply chains is just a euphemism for what can be done without China, whether it's the microchips or less critical items. What is basically required is that in order to have the supply chains, India included in those, the basic requirement is that the duty structure, the customs duties, import duties which have gone up over the years, about 5 years ago, we had reached a happy stage, which we had been aiming at for quite some time, that our import duties should be equal to the ASEAN level of import duties of about average 5%. But since then, having taken up the Make in India mission, the Atmanirbharta mission on a fairly extensive scale, we've been hiking up our duties in order to give protection to our manufacturing industries. And with respect to the PLI, 14 segments of PLI, we have also given them, these are important segments, we have also given them import protection. So I don't see during the currency of the PLI contracts, and PLI as through contractual arrangements between the beneficiary and the government, that the government would play around much with the import duties, reduce them. But otherwise, across the board, there is certainly need that we rationalize our import duties if we have to avail of the opportunity of alternative to China in terms of getting into the critical supply chain, as well as becoming the manufacturing hub for per se labor-intensive industries in the world.
Right, and Mr. Gupta, what about the digitization zeal that has continued to keep India on this upward trajectory? Is there going to be more in that direction? And let's also talk about crypto. The global trend suggests that it is a concept which has been done away with, and India was perhaps the first one to see the prudence and wisdom in not entertaining something as dubious and suspicious as crypto.
So yeah, I think as far as digitization is concerned, digitization and infrastructure development is going to lead the way. So that is something, see, it is a holistic approach. It is not only when you talk about, say, manufacturing, when you talk about opportunities in India, etc., it's a holistic approach. The ease of doing business, etc., is all happening due to the digitization which is happening in the country. The governance and everything is getting digitized. So there will definitely be impetus on digitization. We can see it all over the place. Similarly, when we talk about manufacturing, we also need to become competitive in the world, and competitiveness comes from several areas. The infrastructure development which is happening is going to reduce the logistics cost, which was very high in this country, which was about 15-16% here, whereas in elsewhere it is 8-9-10%. What it basically means is that anything that is produced here in this country, because of the infrastructure not being there in place, automatically becomes 5-6% more expensive. So all of that is happening. You see, it is happening from various areas, and that impetus is all going to keep pace. There are certain things which are not budgetary implications. There are other policy implications which are being done. For example, in public procurement, we are talking about a lot of indigenous manufacturing. We are talking about a lot of indigenous manufacturing in defense and so on and so forth, which will give the right impetus. Our banks, I think after what we did for last 3-4 years, the NPAs, etc., are under control. So the banks are in good shape for giving loans, etc., to the manufacturing sector. So all of these things are coming in place. Not everything is a budgetary exercise per se. But within the budgetary exercise, what I see, I will again kind of say the same thing, that it will be led by infrastructure growth. And I think about 7.5 lakh crores has been, kind of allocated for capex, capital expenditure, which was, I think, last year 5.5 lakh crores or something of that kind is likely to happen. So all those things are going to keep India on the right track.
Right, Mr. Chachra, coming back to you, other areas that the government needs to be focused on, the softer areas, inclusivity and diversity, and of course, liberalizing a number of areas which continue to be, bound by shackles.
I basically think that the earlier speaker was speaking to Pradhan Mantri Krishi, the financial transfers, Krishi Yojana and the financial transfers. I think Important thing from the point of diversity, from the point of social exclusion, and I think time has come, if not this year, in the next year or the years beyond, and in terms of thinking of a basic income guarantee kind of a program. That does many things. Say, for instance, to begin with, an unemployment allowance for young people. That does many things. It creates a pressure on the welfare state, but not just the state, in the general ecosystem, even in the private sector, to create more and more employment. So that also helps in social inclusion. Greater outlays, focused outlays on what is called social diversities, on communities, groups which have historically been sort of oppressed or historically been discriminated. A focused attention, setting up the idea of specific component plans, say for example for the denotified tribes of India, the ex-criminal tribes of India, the pastoral groups. These have been long asked, the fisher folk of India, who face a threat on their livelihoods, who face a threat in the modernizing world and changing circumstances, who face a loss of their commons. So creating focused livelihood opportunities for such socially, historically discriminated groups would be a key focus in terms of, ensuring inclusivity, in terms of ensuring dignity, and in terms of also ensuring what is called Sabka Vikas, Sabke Saath. So I think these are important areas. I think one big challenge coming our way is this rising militarization in the world. If you look at it, defense expenditures of almost all countries in the more recent years have gone up. If you look at it, India's defense expenditure has gone up by about 33% in the last decade itself, from 2012 to 2022. It's 33% increase. And there's greater challenge. India ranks only third after US and China in terms of outlays to military. And I think that challenge is there, of how much more money do you put in military in face of rising militarization. Japan has just introduced a big boost on their military budget. EU, as you know, has significantly enhanced the military spending in the context of Ukraine war. So that will continue to be a challenge. In a pacifist world, you would not be spending on military at all in an ideal world, but that's not where we are. So I think that trade-off would be very, very key, and it's a challenge for us. I think the whole question that I was noting here, the key therefore for future is expansion of revenues. And I think it's time, and I like to reiterate that, it's time to look at wealth creation and actually in a welfare state to create mechanisms of redistribution for that wealth creation. It's not to stop wealth creation, but mechanisms of redistribution of the accumulation of wealth. And I think in this regard, it is very crucial to think of taxing super accumulation of wealth. So it is very important to introduce the idea of wealth tax, to introduce the idea of climate tax on those who are creating the most climate footprint and accumulating the most wealth at the same time. I think these redistributive mechanisms are fundamental to create a financial sort of a narrative or a financial way to look at. And we are talking of budgets, not so much other policy instruments at the moment. And that is a key to ensure greater inclusion. That is a key to address precarities, which are suffered by those who are most excluded in any case. So that's the direction I would hope that we progress for future.
All right. Okay. Great points there. We've run out of time as well. So a lot to contend with, a lot to in fact grapple with for the finance minister. This is a budget which is not only expected to make changes in terms of India's trajectory towards becoming a 5 trillion economy in the next few months or years, but it is also slated to be a budget which is going to galvanize that particular emotion which is required for any political party at any stage to have more support and have more solidarity.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.